Hey guys, and welcome back to another Lost Bits video here on TetraBitGaming, the series where we explore the unused, altered, and unseen content in gaming. Today we are diving back into some more 2D Sonic as we head over to the Game Boy Advance series of games and check out Sonic Advance 1, 2, as well as the third one, all in one video. So grab your GBAs and spin dash into that like button below. It's time to check out some Sonic Advance Lost Bits. Alright, so first up, we of course have to start with the original Sonic Advance. But before we get to the full release of the game, there's actually a prototype build that was dumped online by one Orange Fox. Now, unfortunately for the content of this show, this pre-release build is very close to the final release, with only a few very small differences between them, including this build coming with a complete save file right off the bat, and more importantly, the Chow Garden in this build comes stocked with a single Chow that's been somewhat raised already named Doogie. Now, you better all say hi to Doogie in the comments, or else it's gonna get upsetty spaghetti. Anyways, yeah, that's really about it for the pre-release build, but there are also several screenshots of the game that were taken from even earlier builds that show off quite a few changes that were made for the final version. For starters, probably one of the earliest looks at the game that we know of comes from stills of a teaser trailer that was shown off at E3 of 2001. And here the game looks quite a bit different, featuring different sprites. Sonic has a shadow here, unlike in the final game. And also, this appears to show a slightly more angled, isometric view the game was once planned to have, instead of the more traditional, more so head-on angle that ended up being used. Then, after this, are several other screenshots that, although appear to be from a later build compared to the previous one, they still contain a number of differences, including using a different background graphic. The heads-up display layout is quite a bit different, with the ring looking a bit more chonky, and then the score and timer were offset more. Here we can see some streetlights and signs which were removed from the game. The flowers appear to be missing from the foreground bushes here. Some screenshots show puffs of dust or whatever that would trail behind Sonic and the crew as they run. And here we can also see a shadow under Sonic as he runs on the wall, and both of these things ended up getting cut before release. Next, for Casino Paradise Zone, we can see another early background graphic, and not only is it different, this second early screenshot reveals that originally, the castle in the background would move as you progress through the act, unlike in the final cut, where it's just stationary. Next, we got some screenshots from Egg Rocket Zone, where we can also see some different sections, as well as some alternate sprites for the level's chunks compared to what was used in the final cut. After this, another interesting screenshot that we have is from a THQ disc that was released to the press. And here we can see some debug text in the top right, presumably the value indicating the player's position. And then lastly, for these early screenshots for Sonic Advance 1 here, we also have one for a special stage, and honestly, I think it looks better here than the final versions. Just based on the color scheme, this appears to have been an early version of the second special stage, and here we can also see an early font for the ring goal counter. And while screenshots are nice and all, there are also some videos that were recorded of a demo in mid-2001. And here, notable differences include early and different sprites for both the dash pads as well as the item boxes. And then also some of the other differences that I noted earlier, like the early ring heads-up display sprite, as well as the early background for Neo Green Hill Zone here. Now next, let's finally move on to the full release of Sonic Advance, where first up we have an unused alternate invincibility theme. Let's give it a listen. And although unused in this game, you actually may recognize this theme if you've ever played Sonic Advance 2 or 3, as this invincibility theme did go on to be used in both of those games. Then next, we have unused sprites for animations of Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, as well as Amy flipping around vertically while running. Now it's assumed that these animations were intended to be used in Cosmic Angel Zone as well as in Egg Rocket for whenever gravity changes. Now, it's not exactly clear why these weren't implemented, especially considering that they're, well, still left over in the game, but in the final version of the game, the characters just instantly flip whenever the gravity changes in those levels. Next up, there are actually remnants of what looks to be an 8th special stage left over in the game that goes unused, but it can actually be accessed by modding in a special spring into the game's X zone. Once getting into this unused special stage, you'll start to notice a few oddities, including there being a complete lack of any sort of objects, including checkpoints and rings, and despite saying that you need 64 rings here at the start, the stage sets the goal at 999 rings, and well, without any rings in this stage, this is completely impossible. And yeah, as such, once you do enter this special stage, the game essentially soft locks as there's no way to escape it besides resetting the game. Then, also dealing with the special springs, if you mod one into the extra zone, an area where special springs are normally never seen, two things can be noted. First, this will, oddly enough, actually take you back to the first special stage that's normally only accessible from Neo Green Hill Zone. And then secondly, doing this also reveals that despite how the developers wanted to make it seem, this stage isn't actually an auto-scroller at all, but rather it's a clever mix of the bottom graphics rapidly scrolling to the left, and the background graphic parallaxing to create an illusion that Sonic is always moving to the right, when in fact, he isn't. It's kinda weird to see, honestly. Next, moving on to the multiplayer stuff, although not really unused or anything, the way this game handles the multiplayer mode is pretty interesting. So basically, the game shares info like location, movement, items, etc. between all players, but on the other hand, all level data is actually handled client-side. So, although certainly not super practical or anything, if you do mod the game a bit and change the level of one of the players with different data, you can actually still play on that modded level, and doing so will cause all of the other players in the session to appear either floating, phasing through level chunks, taking damage from nothing, you get the picture. Honestly, it's pretty wild to see, and I just did this with 2 players, but if you take this to an extreme, you could probably have all 4 players playing on different levels at the same time in the same multiplayer game, which I guess wouldn't really make it as multiplayer at all then, so I digress. And then, last up for this first game here is actually a to be continued screen that goes unused. And to add to it, there's also object data left over that when touching it in a level can also cause this screen to be triggered before the game then resets and soft locks the player. Now I didn't show it earlier with the E3 gameplay video, but much like we've seen with other to be continued graphics on this series, for a short bit at the end of one of the recordings, we can see that this screen was in fact used at the end of the demos shown off at E3 2001. And I guess this just never ended up getting removed for the final cut. Now moving on to Sonic Advance 2, there's once again a pre-release build of the game that was dumped online by Forest of Illusion in early 2022, with thanks to Clark0 for sending it in. Unfortunately though, it's once again basically the same as the release version of the game with not really any notable differences, and it's believed that this was a review build of the game that was provided to outlets by Nintendo themselves. Now, although there weren't any major changes in that build, the same can't be said for a pre-release build that was actually shown off in Sonic Mega Collection. And here, differences start off right at the title screen, where instead of the sky and clouds used as the background, there it's seen as a simple blue checkered one. And then other differences seen in this teaser compared to the final game include a lack of Amy, many sprites are just reused here from the first Sonic Advance, including those for Knuckles falling, as well as those for the character select screen. The character select screen is also seen with a simple blue background here instead of the SA2 graphics scrolling that are seen in the final build. And then there are also several elements that are either missing or are slightly different on the overworld map screen. And then, although we can't know if it was actually ever in the game itself, this trailer also uses a background music track that is never heard in the final game, or anywhere else for that matter, and although it's not 100% clear where this track was intended for, since it does have a similar vibe, there is a chance it could have maybe been meant for Leaf Forest Zone Act 1. There is, of course, also the chance that it wasn't meant for the game at all and was just meant for this trailer. But personally, I strongly doubt they'd make up some music that goes this hard only to be used like that. And then, like we saw with Advance 1, there are also a few screenshots for Advance 2 that appear to show some pre-release differences. We got this screenshot of Leaf Forest that appears to use some darker colors compared to the final. Then we got a pair of screenshots from Music Plant, where we can see an unused flying sprite of Tails as it appears a bit different compared to the one that's seen in the release version. And then in both of these, the color palette used for the background sprite is a bit different. Similarly, there are also some early screenshots of Hot Crater with a slightly different background and different tile set. And then one of the weirdest things is that in this screenshot with Cream, we can see the game using Amy's icon instead, seemingly with Cream's color palette resulting in a pretty cursed looking icon. And yeah, I guess this suggests that the screenshot was taken at a point from before Cream was fully implemented. Then additionally, there are also other early screenshots that appear to use an updated, but still early version of Cream's life meter icon. And get this, the difference between this one and the final version is a whopping single pixel that was added to, I guess, extend Cream's eyelash. Crazy, I know. And speaking of cream and cheese, there's also an early screenshot from the Chow Bounce minigame from Advance 2's Tiny Chow Garden. And here we can again see some different coloring, most noticeably with the grass as well as cheese here. And now onto the full release of Sonic Advance 2. First we have a leftover texture from an early build, and this one spells out TGS version. So it looks like this was very likely a graphic used in a demo build of Sonic Advance 2 that was shown off at the Tokyo Game Show in 2002, probably on the title screen. And speaking of the title screen, there's also this unused texture that's basically a copy of the copyright info seen on the title screen, but with a black background instead. Then, Sonic Advance 2 thankfully also has some unused textures not related to the title screen, and these include leftover sprites from Sonic Advance 1 for the animation of Sonic transforming into Super Sonic. We got unused sprites of this drum, which, being an instrument, was likely meant to be seen in the Music Plant level of the game. And based on this animation, it seems like it would have functioned as an object that the player could bounce off of. And then lastly, we got several sprites for the Egg Doctor turning around during the boss fight in Ice Paradise. In the battle in the final game, Egghead is only ever seen flying to the right, and only after being defeated he'll face left after escaping in a smaller pod. So based on these turning around sprites existing, it's entirely plausible that this boss fight was originally conceptualized to play out differently with Eggman turning around at least once. Next, there's a strange unused windmill object that was likely intended to have been used in Sky Canyon. And not only can it be re-implemented in the game, but it's still animated too. Apparently, loading this in takes a decent amount of resources, so that might have been the contributing factor as to why this never ended up getting used. Then another unused thing is that there's coding left over in Sonic Advance 2 here for changing water height. This coding basically lets you set a starting height and end height for the water level in a given act. And yeah, I guess lowering or emptying water from a section was a mechanic that was at least somewhat planned, or it's also very likely that this is a leftover from the Ice Mountain boss fight in the first Sonic Advance where changing water levels was seen. Now next up, although the option of team play in the multiplayer mode was seen in Sonic Advance 1, this option was removed from Sonic Advance 2. Well, mostly, as it turns out that graphics and functionality for it are still left over in Sonic Advance 2, and can even be re-implemented with only minor issues. And then lastly for this game, there's actually a map that's left over unused. It isn't the most interesting unused map in the world, as it's a pretty basic looking area with a floor section and then a ceiling filled with nothing but spikes. Now, apparently, this map is stored in the game after each zone's boss battle, so they can kind of be thought of as an Act 4 of sorts for each zone. And interestingly enough, this level actually appears to bear major resemblance to the final section of the boss battle in the final zone, where the platform on the bottom ends and then the player has to avoid staying on the lifts long enough as they push you up to a bunch of spikes placed on the ceiling. So as such, it's entirely likely that this unused map is an early conceptual version of that boss fight area. And now, last up for this video, we of course wrap up this trilogy with Sonic Advance 3, and we once again have a pre-release build of the game that was dumped online with only a few minor differences. And apparently, this build was actually leaked by an employee of a magazine 3 months before the game's release, and as you'd expect, Sega wasn't very happy. I guess some things just never seem to change. Anyways, yeah, there aren't many noteworthy changes in this earlier build, but of note, the invincibility power-up lasts half as long in this build at only 10 seconds instead of the final version's 20. Partner Amy's tag action works a bit differently in this build when used on the ground, as instead of putting the player into spring form to launch them higher, here it will instead put the player into a spin attack. You can actually use the tag actions in the Sonic Factory here, unlike in the final version where the game doesn't allow you to. And then another oddity is that if you grab the special stage key in a level in this build and then get a game over or exit the stage, you will still hang on to the key without actually having to complete the level as it was changed to in the final version of the game. And now onto the full release. First up, we got several bits of unused audio. Well, the first two tracks here aren't fully unused, as their beginning sections are actually heard in the game, but they do get cut off, leaving the latter half normally unheard, unless you go and listen to them in full in the sound test menu. Anyways, the start of both of these tracks are heard in the cutscene that occurs when playing as Sonic with all 7 Chaos Emeralds after completing Alter Emerald. The first track is normally only heard for the first 18 seconds before getting cut off by the second track. And with the full track being around 70 seconds long, yeah, there's a big chunk that gets cut. Here's a small sample. And then secondly, the other track is only played for just over 20 seconds before the cutscene ends and the music stops, and the full length of the track is again over a minute long, so once more, a large chunk of this is normally unheard. So again, here's a snippet of the part of the track that normally goes unheard, and if you want to listen to the track in full, definitely head on over to the Cutting Room Floor page, which I'll have linked for you in my sources in the description. Now next up is an unused sound clip of Knuckles just saying cool.
Cool.
Yeah, it is pretty cool. And interestingly, this also didn't get used in the Japanese release, so there's a Japanese equivalent unused file too of Knuckles just giving a short chuckle. Yeah, it's a big shame we didn't get these Knuckles chuckles. Now apparently, the sound effects were planned to be used when Knuckles would perform a trick in this game. But since he's unable to do any tricks in this game, yeah, this doesn't normally go used. And then lastly, for the audio stuff, we have 2 more unused tracks. The first of these is an extended version of the victory theme that's played after defeating the game's final boss. And extended it certainly is, as this track actually goes on for nearly a minute. Here's a quick sample of the extended part of the theme. And then secondly, there's another track that's believed to have been a tune meant for a hub area, as it's found amongst the other hub area themes in the game's sound test menu. Let's give it a listen. And finally, there are also some graphics left in Sonic Advance 3 that go unused. First off, there are various tiles left over in the game, and some of them, like these for the hub area, reveal some chunks that weren't implemented, such as a few of these that show graphics for loop-de-loops for the stage that never ended up getting added. Next, another odd thing is that although Sonic and Tails are normally unlocked and playable right off the get-go as soon as you start up the game, by modifying the game a bit, you can actually lock them back up, and this will cause normally unseen silhouette graphics for both of them to be seen on the Character Select menu. Then next, we got some graphics of some text reading 0 to 4, to 5 to 9, to 1, 10 to 14, to 2, and then 0 to 4 to 4. Yeah, I don't know. And then we also have a static version of the graphic with the values seemingly separated, and then oddly enough, a flashing version of this graphic too. This seems like something that would have been in some sort of developer debugging tool or something, but honestly, I have no clue what this could have been for, so if you might know, please let us know down in the comments. Then, after this, we have this graphic that was intended to have served as a thumbnail preview graphic for the Alter Emerald stage, but since the player is unable to access this level from any sort of menu or the Sonic Factory, this never gets used. And then lastly, we have graphics that appear to reveal that there might have been plans for at least some of the game's levels to have had a fourth act. And it's not just this texture that supports this either, as apparently there is a slot reserved for a fourth act in the map index layout in almost all of the game's stages too. I think it's kinda too bad, as more levels tends to be a good thing, but I don't think I recall any Sonic Zone having more than 3 acts, and maybe it was deemed that having 4 here would have had the levels drag on for too long, or something. But either way, this texture still managed to get left in here. And my friends, that's about it for the Sonic Advance series, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, check out some of my other Sonic Lost Bits videos, and be sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell to find your way back to the channel in the future. Also, just want to give an extra big thank you to Tempo, Fresh Ollie, Jace, Luna Alex, as well as a bunch of the other fellas at the Sonic Advance Trilogy Research Discord for being incredibly helpful with making this video possible. And as always, thank you all so much for stopping by today, and I will see you in a bit.